I am Monica Costa Dias, and I am delighted to welcome you all to this WeAre and WinE joint seminar, which today hosts Natalie Bau. Natalie is an associate professor at UCLA, and she's also a CEPR research fellow. She's a really big contributor to improving our understanding of the drivers of human capital investments, especially in traditional settings, and what incentives these investments respond to. And as well as on the role of cultural institutions and public policies in driving human capital. But today, she's actually going to talk to us not about her research per se, but about a journey to tenure. So she's going to share her experiences and thoughts on careers in academic economics, particularly in relation to women.
I prepared sort of some brief slides based on my own experience, but I'd really prefer to answer your questions. So, first I would just encourage you, as Monica mentioned, to ask questions throughout on topics that are interesting or important to you. And second, I would, I'll try and end quite early so we can just kind of have more of a conversation. All right, so I'm going to talk about the journey to tenure. Okay, so just to kind of give you a bit about my background in case it's helpful for thinking about what are useful questions. As Monica mentioned, my research agenda is in development economics, focusing mainly on human capital, productivity, and culture. I received my PhD in public policy from Harvard University in 2015, and so actually I'm kind of one of the few people in economics who actually doesn't technically have an economics PhD. Which I think used to be kind of a different experience, but is decreasingly the case that it matters. So I won't talk too much about that unless people have questions. I started my first job at Toronto Economics the year I graduated, and then I moved to UCLA Public Policy in 2018, and then to UCLA Economics in 2020. And so I have a lot of experience with lateral moves. And working in both econ and interdisciplinary departments, doing an interdisciplinary PhD. So I just wanted to mention that in case it's helpful for the kinds of questions you might have. I won the Sloan Fellowship for Economics in 2022, and I received tenure in UCLA Economics the same year. Okay, so in terms of what I prepared to talk about, I sort of tried to think about what are things that I struggled with on the path to tenure, and what can I sort of say about what I've learned about those things. But like I mentioned, mainly I just want to answer your specific questions, and so hopefully a lot of this will just be conversation or Q&A. So here's a few things that I struggled with on the way to tenure. So the first is discrimination against non-economics PhDs on the junior job market. As I mentioned, I think this is less of a problem today. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that unless those questions. Then other three things I think are like the problems that a lot of people end up struggling with. So perhaps it's very useful to talk about. The first is getting those first papers published. And those first conference and seminar invites when you're in your first couple of years as an assistant professor. So I wasn't somebody who had a lot of buzz when they went on the job market. And so it was kind of important for me to try and, get myself out there at the beginning of my career. I also had to move laterally to solve a two-body problem. That's actually why I moved to UCLA in 2018. And I know that this is increasingly important for a lot of people, and especially a lot of women that have partners who are also academic economists. And so this is something that I often get questions about. And then I'll talk a little bit about the idea that, how do you craft a research agenda for going up for tenure? And a lot of people often get feedback, and I certainly got feedback, that the research agenda is too broad or it's not coherent enough for going up for tenure. So we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so let me kind of get into that, publishing that first paper. So the weird thing about PhD is you sort of spend a lot of time learning how to, do research. But for most PhD economists, there's very little training on how to actually publish a paper. And so for those of us who've been out there for a few years, we know that actually going from that polished working paper, which is that product you spend your whole PhD producing, to actually getting that paper published that's like a process that can take years. It can take more time to go from that polished working paper to that published paper than it takes to generate that polished working paper. And so, this is sort of, when we talk about a hidden curriculum in economics, I think this is a big part of the hidden curriculum is how do you actually get a paper across the finish line and through the publication process? Now, honestly, I think the best way to learn how to do this is learning by doing. And that often means working with co-authors who've done it before and who you can learn from. So I was very lucky. When I was in my PhD, I co-authored with my advisor on a paper. This is my paper on bias, which was ultimately published in the JPE. And so, so from the beginning to end, that was an incredible mentorship experience where I could learn about how to write a paper. But I think the thing that was especially helpful was learning about all those stages you don't get to see during the PhD, like how do you, like what are left-wing letters like? How do you kind of respond to these left-wing letters? How do you respond to an editor letter? How do you go for kind of multiple rounds of revisions? So I think the absolute best way to learn how to do this is learning by doing. And I think that sometimes juniors get advice not to work with senior people because they're told, oh, your contributions will be discounted. For example, if Natalie writes a paper with advisor, of course it's great if it publishes in a top journal. She might not get the same level of credit for it as if she wrote the paper with another person who is at the same kind of point in their career. And so, there's some truth to that. But I think a lot of the benefits of mentoring and learning early on kind of outweigh those costs. And so I would definitely say don't be afraid to co-author, at least part of your portfolio with senior people, because you're going to learn so much about how to go through that process of trying to get a paper published. But short of, actually being able to do this learning by doing, I'll give you like a few thoughts on how to publish that first paper. And so this is kind of my step-by-step recipe. So this is kind of, you have your polished working paper and you're ready to send it out. What do we do now? Well, I think step one, choose a journal. And this is actually, I think, more important than people often think. So, because journals have different editors. And so sometimes there will be a journal as an editor who's really knowledgeable about the subject area you're working in. And other times there'll be a journal that, they have an editor who's kind of in your broad field or handles the papers from your broad field, but they're not necessarily very knowledgeable about your specific subject area. They're not going to know off the top of their head who are the right referees to send the paper to. And so, of course, that doesn't mean you can't publish in those journals, but I think that if you can find an editor who's a good match for the paper, that really helps when trying to publish the paper. And so I think it's really worth thinking about, what journal has an editorial board that's a good match for your paper, and then condition on the journal, which editor at that journal is a good match for your paper. The other thing I noticed that tends to be a little bit of a hurdle for juniors and PhD students is that they sometimes forget that writing matters a lot. Sometimes, arguably, perhaps more than anything. Sorry. Arguably more than anything else. So, say you are sending your paper to a top journal. Well, the first hurdle is to get through the desk reject stage, right? So the editor has to be able to take a look at your abstract and intro and say, okay, this paper is general interest. And, even if you're past the desk reject stage, the referees need to be able to look at your paper and say, okay, this paper is general interest, because the easiest way to kind of reject the paper is to say, well, this paper is just not general interest enough for this journal. And so it's worth spending a lot of time writing and rewriting your paper, and not just thinking about things like grammar and flow, but also whether, the paper has a good pitch. It's convincing people of the importance of the topic. And so this is something that senior colleagues often can help you a lot with. So if you have a good relationship with your advisor, even after you graduate, you can just send them your abstract. It's, that's 100 words, 200 words. So it's very fast for them to look at it. Or if you have mentors at your institution, maybe you don't want to take up a lot of the time looking at your whole paper, but having them go through kind of your intro or your abstract tool and make sure that you've refined your pitch, I think is really high return still effort. It's also important for writing not just to be compelling in terms of kind of explaining why your paper is important, but also to be clear and correct. So you should have like explanations about what you do that are contradictory or unclear, because this is actually a signal to the referees that you're not sloppy, right? The referees don't get to see your code. They don't get necessarily to see everything you did on the back end. So they need to be kind of convinced by your paper that you're like someone who's really careful and they can take your word for what you're doing. And so part of that is making your writing very clear. And, keep in mind, we all like to bash referees, myself included. We all have like horrible stories about referee number 2, but referees are typically uncompensated, and they're definitely not compensated at the value of their time, and they're very overworked. So part of what you should do in your writing is make their job easy. If a referee is asked to hunt for things because you haven't made them clear, you're making their job hard, and you just shouldn't expect, unfortunately, you shouldn't expect people to kind of go above and beyond for you. Okay, the next thing is important to recognize, especially at the beginning of your career when you're kind of learning how to do things, is that rejection is just the modal outcome. And that's true for everybody, even most papers that I published in top journals were rejected at other top journals. So even for highly successful people, the modal outcome for any paper they submit is going to be a rejection. And so the most important skill, I think, in academia and, perhaps in life more broadly, is not get discouraged by rejections. Take a week, don't think about the paper for a little bit, and then, come back to it. But don't get discouraged. Because especially, I think, when you're starting out and you're not used to this process of being rejected and having to kind of revise based on rejections, I think people can get really discouraged at this point. And that's like kind of when I think about people who've been able to continue and successful in academia versus people who've kind of had difficulty eventually publishing the work. It's really about how discouraged they get by rejections. Like I said, remember, this is the modal outcome for everybody. And also, when you get a rejection, especially if you have high quality referee reports, keep in mind that often you're in a field that's not super big. And so you're likely to get the same, if you had referees that were chosen well for your paper, you're likely to get those referees again. And so if you see that those feedback that improves the paper in the referee reports, I think you should take that feedback seriously and try and revise the paper. People give conflicting advice about this. I've seen senior people say, just don't waste any time, don't edit the paper at all, just turn around, send it out again. But realistically, I think that, given you're likely to get the same referees again and you lose so much time in the referee process, it's useful to actually try and address feedback, especially if it's good feedback that improves the paper. Okay, oops, sorry. All right, so last, so let's say you get through all those rejections and you finally get a revise and resubmit. I think here's another place where people often stumble. It's very important, the revise and resubmit process, to really convince the referees that you've taken their feedback seriously and to try and integrate all of their feedback. If you think that their feedback is stupid or doesn't make sense, you don't necessarily have to integrate it if you think that makes the paper worse, but you need to politely kind of explain why. You can't just say this referee is an idiot and they have no idea what they're talking about. And so this is another place where I think there's a real alt form to writing referee letters and letters to the editor and an all. And so I would really suggest that on those first all-in-alls, especially if you haven't done it before with a senior colleague, to ask a mentor to look at your response letters and make sure they kind of conform to the unwritten rules of what response letters should look like. Because, typically once you got an all, the chances of being published are very high, but it's also very easy to stumble at this stage if you don't know how to do an all. So thinking about where do you want to actually use your mentors or your senior colleagues' time for advice, I would say taking a look at your response letters is definitely, along with those abstracts and intros, is definitely a really high returns place to make use of your mentors. Okay, so let me pause for a second because I'm going to move on from trying to publish those first papers. So any questions about the publication process that I can answer? And also, I just want to make sure actually that I'm not sure that I can see if hands are raised, so also feel free to unmute and ask if you have questions.
There are no hands raised.
Perfect. Okay. So then the next thing I think that people often stumble with at the beginning of the career is no one is inviting them to seminars. And academia does a lot of holding. So, you might see some people on Twitter complaining that they have so many invitations, that they're traveling all the time. And so, yes, there's like a few very, very prominent people who have so many more invites than they can reasonably say yes to. But I think the model assistant professor starting out likely has few or no invites. Now, is this a problem? Well, it's not a huge problem because, like I said, most people are in this situation, but it is also important to present. And there's a few reasons why you really want to make sure that you're presenting even early in your career. The first is that presentations are just part of your merit and tenure evaluations, depending on your institution. So your institution will look at how much you're being invited to present and where you're presenting as kind of a signal about your influence in the profession. The second is just that it's important for disseminating your work. Papers in economics are extremely long. And so people often are not going to sit down and read a 50-page paper, but they may be open to, seeing it presented to them. And so, one of the jokes I say to my partner is nobody reads anymore. Everyone just sees things as presentations. And so it is an important part of making sure that people see your work and end up citing your work and being influenced by your work. And along with this point that, people don't read as much anymore, in terms of people writing your tenure letters down the line, you want them to have seen your work so that they're aware of what you're working on and they'd kind of know your research agenda. Presenting is also really important if you want to move laterally, like if you want to go on the job market again as a junior. And I'll talk a little bit more on this on kind of the next part of my presentation. So generally speaking, the best advice for anything, how do you publish good papers? How do you get good presentation invites is just write great papers. That's kind of always the best advice. But even everything else is kind of marginal. But I'm going to talk about some things that you can do on the margin to try and increase the amount that you're getting presented. Okay. So one thing to keep in mind is that many schools or institutions have limited budgets for seminars. I'm not talking about the Harvard and Yale seal, but many places, especially good schools that maybe are international and maybe you're based in the US and a school in Europe or school in Australia, they're going to have limited budgets to bring out speakers from another country. And so if you're traveling somewhere anyway, it is kind of no harm done by reaching out in advance to someone in your field and letting them know that you'll be in the area in case they would like you to give a presentation. I mean, obviously the tone here should not be, hey, give me a seminar, but it's useful information for people to know, that they could save $2,000 on travel fees if you happen to be in the area. The other thing is, especially starting out in your career, that you can apply to a lot of conferences. So again, that rule of don't be discouraged definitely applies here because of the modal response to everything is rejection. So you don't want to get discouraged when you get rejected from conferences. And I think keep in mind that it's not very informative. When you get rejected from conferences, often conferences are getting hundreds of applications. They have program committees of like 10 people. And so nobody is going to be going through your papers in incredible detail when they're deciding on whether or not to put it on the conference program. So again, take very little signal from rejections here. In thinking about what conferences to target, I would say that the highest return conferences are usually small conferences focused on your specific area, because those are typically going to be the conferences that really have the people who interested in your literature attending them, and where you're going to have really the opportunity to talk to and meet people, especially those conferences have limited or no parallel sessions. Another thing that you should be doing anyway as a junior is just meeting with seminar speakers at your institution and telling them about your most exciting work. And in fact, yes, I have gotten invites this way. Again, the tone should not be, give me a seminar invite. But if you have things that are exciting and you're clearly excited about, if you meet with speakers or in that area, they may just want to see that work once they hear about it. So, just try and get those ideas out there. And in fact, like, people may often invite you just because they want to see that paper. And all this, I should say, is a virtuous cycle, because the more people see your work, the more invites you'll get. So if you go and present at conferences and people say, oh, I didn't know about this Natalie, but now I see she's doing interesting stuff, why don't I invite her for a seminar? So it just becomes this virtuous cycle where presentations generate presentations. Okay, so one of the last things I wanted to talk about is two-body problems in academia. And so particularly for women, two-body problems are increasingly frequent. And unfortunately, they're often not solved on the initial junior market. So what I mean by that is that often two people will go on the junior market, but they won't necessarily find jobs in the same place. They may not even try very hard to find jobs in the same place when they do their initial job search. And there's there's a variety of reasons for this. First, finding jobs in the same place is hard. So even if you try pretty hard, you may not be able to do it. Your advisors may also advise you to privately optimize for a period for career reasons. So if you both can work at better institutions, if you don't go to the same place, they may say that there's very high returns to doing this early in your career. And so you should wait. Now, I say this kind of as a positive and not normative statement. I think this all comes down to your preferences. And so I'm not advising that people should or shouldn't do this. But I think for whatever reason, often these two-body problems don't get resolved on the initial junior market. Now, like I said, as usual, the best thing you can do in any situation is to write and publish good papers. It's true for getting presentations, it's true for, solving two-body problems. But again, on the margin, of course, there are all things that you can do to try and help resolve these problems and strategies you can develop based on your preferences. So, like, many people, when I initially went on the job market, my partner and I didn't resolve our two-body problem. Actually, we ended up with a pretty bad two-body problem. I was based in Toronto and my partner was based at the LSE. So we had an intercontinental two-body problem. And the advice I got from Oriana Bandiera is that you should choose a time period, big T, after which you sort of say, we're going to resolve this problem by big T. And you go on the market together and you just resolve it. Now, your mileage may vary here. I mean, some people don't care that much about being in the same place. And, so of course, in that case, you may not be willing to give up much to resolve the two-body problem, but many people do want to be in the same place. And so if you strongly want to be in the same place, I think it makes sense to kind of have this big T strategy, because otherwise it's very easy to keep kicking the problem down the road, right? And so for us, big T was 3 years. Okay, so typically, if you haven't solved the two-body problem in the initial job market, in your initial junior market, you're going to be on the lateral market, say when you're 3 or 4 years out. And the lateral market is really different from the initial junior market. And so actually, you have to kind of just think about, you have to adopt a different strategy when you're on the lateral market. So one issue is that often the schools that are hiring may not pay attention to applicants who are not fresh PhDs unless you kind of signal to them. They are typically very focused on people who are just graduating. And so it's pretty easy if you just send out an application as a lateral candidate just to be overlooked. In addition, they may not figure lateral applicants' desire to move is actually credible. And so if you adopt that strategy of that you probably had on the initial junior market of applying to 100 schools and hoping it works out, you probably, it's very likely that those applications will just be overlooked. For the lateral market, it's more important, I think, to target specific schools that you're interested in that have kind of a very good fit with you in terms of your publication record, your interests, your locational preferences. And then to reach out to people at those schools to let them know you are applying and why. Your PhD advisor can also help you with this if you have a good relationship with them. And in general, if you have a two-body problem, don't be afraid to let people know that you're looking to resolve your two-body problem in advance and what the constraints of your search are. So, when I was an assistant professor, often people would sort of say, oh, how do you like UToronto? And there's always kind of a subtext of that question there, are you looking to move? And so even if you like your institution, if you have a two-body problem, it might make sense to say something like, Toronto's really great, I really like it, but I have a two-body problem, so ultimately I think we're gonna have to try and move to resolve this problem. Okay, and so the last thing I wanted to talk about is this question of how important is a research agenda. So when I was an assistant professor, I often got feedback that my agenda was too broad. But on the other hand, it's my view that you write your best papers if you write the papers that you want to write. And so that kind of pushes back against this idea that, you should really try and carefully craft an agenda in one particular direction. I should say that in general, you're going to probably end up with a bit of an agenda no matter what, because papers usually breed papers. Once you start working on something you're interested in, new questions are going to come up and you keep working on those questions. So while I would be cautious about taking advice to be overly strategic on your research agenda, because like I said, I think it's so important to write the papers you want to write. There are a few reasons why having a research agenda can be important. The first, for hiring, especially at the assistant professor level, pretty much all hiring is done by fields. And so if you don't fit into a clear field, it can be really challenging to get hired because there's not really a clear constituency to support your hire. There's not really a clear position for your hiring. So I think, it's helpful to at least have a field that you can identify with and credibly identify with. When I say credibly identify with, if you say, I'm a development economist, but all your papers are on the US, that's not very credible to people, right? The other reason having a research agenda can be important is for tenure and fellowships. The committees are often looking for letter writers to write something like X is the leader and Y, right? And it's very hard to be the leader in all of economics, or even all of labor economics, or all of development economics, right? Now, of course, if you're Esther Duflo, I'm sure your tenure writers could write X is the leader in development economics. But for most people, right, it's hard to be a leader in like such a broad area. And so having a coherent research agenda makes it easier to establish leadership in a specific sub-area. Although this can cut the other way if there's a perception that your sub-area is too narrow. So these are kind of the reasons you do want to have some sort of like coherent research agenda. That said, especially for tenure, you're going to write a research statement and you have the opportunity to establish a narrative about how your work fits together to make it kind of more obvious for your reading committee or your tenure letter writers. And so, for example, in my case, I have worked on the IO of education markets, misallocation of capital, and cultural economics. One way to kind of look at this would be, well, Alice is a person who's working in very disparate areas. But another way to say this would be, I'm a development economist who focuses on two of the fundamental drivers of economic growth, human capital and productivity. And so that, shows that there's actually a very coherent thread that goes through this agenda. And so I think, especially as you come up for tenure, you don't necessarily have to be extremely strategic in what papers you write, but it's useful to think about how to craft that narrative. Okay, so I think that's everything that I wanted to kind of tell you about today.